Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. This is Semi-Homesteading with Abby, where basically I'm trying to learn as many homesteading and homemaking skills as possible, even though I live in the suburbs. It's going well so far, I've learned a lot, so make sure you subscribe to my channel so you never miss a video. Today we're gonna make a loaf of San Francisco style sourdough. My aunt taught me how to make this about 6 months back, and she basically FaceTimed me through the whole process. Like, we would FaceTime, I would show her exactly what was happening with my loaf, and she would show me what was happening with hers so I could kind of compare, and it was so much more helpful than just trying to read some article that explains the steps. So I thought a how-to video would be very useful if you were trying to make a loaf of sourdough bread, because I don't know, at least for me, it's easier to have a visual where I can walk through it step by step and make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, let's talk about the timing of making this bread because it does require some planning. Usually I start feeding my sourdough in the afternoon and then let the bulk rise happen overnight. So I wanted to lay out the steps a little bit for you, and I will link this in the description as well. But you feed the sourdough and wait about 4 to 6 hours. Then you have to mix the dough and let it rest for 30 minutes. So by that time, it's usually around 8 p.m. Fold it again and let it bulk rise overnight so that in the morning I can just do the stretching of the dough, and then you have to fold again, and then you have to bake it, which takes 50 minutes total. 20 minutes of that is covered and 30 minutes is uncovered. So overall, it's a pretty time-consuming process. There's a lot of downtime, so it doesn't feel like I'm constantly just baking all the time or doing things all the time, but it does take 16 to 21 hours, so definitely plan that in accordingly. I'll also put these times in the description as a reference. So let's get into making a loaf of sourdough bread. The first step is to feed your starter. So let me go get my starter and we'll feed it together. All right, so all you need for the initial sourdough feeding is your sourdough starter. Now I got my starter from my aunt. You can also make your own starter. I will also make a video about making your own starter, but for this one, I just got it from my aunt. Then throughout the process of making the sourdough, I actually use 2 different types of flour. But for the feeding, I use this whole wheat milled flour. This is just from King Soopers, it's Kroger brand. Whole wheat, at least in my experience, tends to make the starter more active, and it's just better than using like all-purpose flour. The only other thing you need is lukewarm water, and we can get to feeding it. Now, if you're making a lot of loaves a week, you can keep your starter just out on the counter and you'll have to feed it probably every day. I keep my starter in the fridge and I only feed it about once a week. It's definitely hungry. It has a little bit of the liquid on the top, so I'm just gonna dump that out. And then we only really need to use about 1/2 cup of the starter. So I'm just gonna pour it into the measuring cup for now. The rest you can just throw away. There's also a lot of discard recipes, so you can bake with this. Also, if you have chickens, the chickens really like it, but for right now I don't have chickens and I have nothing to bake with the discard, so I'm just gonna throw it away. I'm actually gonna use this other new clean weck jar because it's just easier for me to show you kind of what the levels are and how much it rises and stuff like that. So we're gonna use a new jar. You don't have to, I usually just put it back into the same weck jar, but we will dump that 1/2 cup of sourdough starter into the jar. Then you want to put about 1 cup of your whole wheat flour into the jar. Once you get to the dough, it's much more precise. We're going to be measuring grams of flour and water and all that. For the starter feeding, it doesn't have to be that particular. So I put about 1 cup into here, and then we do 1/2 cup or maybe a little bit more of lukewarm water. All right, put that in there. All right, now we stir. This tool has been the absolute best with sourdough mixing. It's a perfect size to scrape it down. I think this is just a standard like spurtle if you've seen those commercials, but this size in particular is just perfect. So I mix this up together. This is looking a little bit thick. I'm gonna actually add a little bit more water here. I think I had the flour very packed in there, so we're just gonna add a little bit more water and stir it all around. All right, this is what the consistency looks like for my starter. And we're just gonna leave this sitting out on the counter with the lid just kind of ajar. I just kind of put it like this and have this little open space and the lid resting on top. The air particles help this all to bubble and double in size and all of that. So whatever level this is at in the jar is supposed to double. So over the course of about 4 to 5 hours, it should go from here to about here. That's the first step. That's all we have to do for now. So just set this on your counter for about 4 to 5 hours and I'll see you back here shortly to make our dough. All right, it has been about 4 hours now, and as you can see, we have a nicely doubled sourdough. Mine haven't always doubled like this. I used to think it was an altitude thing where it wouldn't completely double, but it turns out my ratios were just off. So if it's not completely doubling, I would try to do different ratios of flour and water until you get it to the nice doubling stage. So now that this is done, we're gonna make our sourdough loaf dough. For this, we definitely need to be precise. So I'm gonna take out my scale, and you're gonna want a big bowl. Zero out the scale. And then we get to mixing. So you're gonna wanna put about 100 grams of the sourdough starter into the bowl. Then I put that just right back in the fridge to feed for the next week. You do 350 grams of hot water and then a tablespoon and a half of salt, and you're gonna mix that all together. It does not look appetizing at this point, and I definitely understand that, but it'll all shape up once you add the flour. So you add 500 grams of all-purpose flour or bread flour, either one you would like, and you can start mixing it with a spurtle, but eventually it gets so tacky and thick that you just gotta get in there with your hands. You're gonna have to pick it up, squish it through your fingers, and really get it fully incorporated. Make sure you don't have any of your rings on or anything like that, because no instrument is going to really do this justice. You just got to get in there with your hands. I've seen people do this in a much more elegant method. I don't exactly know how, because clearly I'm not fragile or delicate with this at all. I'm really getting it into my fingers. So as soon as I'm done and it's fully incorporated, I pick off as much from my fingers as I can, and I kind of try to form it into a little bit more of a ball, kind of do a little fold and stretch technique, just to get it to a point where, you know, it's not just a glob of little scraps you just peeled off your fingers. So this is what it should look like once you've incorporated it and formed it. You're going to want to take a kitchen rag or kitchen towel, wet it with warm water, and cover that. You'll set it on there for 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, you'll uncover it, and this part is very quick. All you have to do is just stretch and fold the dough, give it a little bit of tension. So I usually do it around just the 4 sides. So do it 4 times and kind of try to form it again into more of a ball and more into a good shape so it has an easy time rising. I cover that again and do the bulk rise for 10 hours overnight. Good morning, everyone. It is 6:18 a.m., which means this has been rising for about 12 hours. So let me show you how it looks. As you can see, it's a lot fluffier, a lot bigger. It did the bulk rising, and it's looking good. So we're on the home stretch here to actually bake it, and I will show you what all that involves. I wiped down the counter last night, but just in case my cat got up here or anything, I'm gonna wipe it down again this morning. Okay, then we need to flour our surface. So I just sprinkle a decent amount onto the counter and then kind of scrape out your sourdough loaf onto that surface. Okay, now I'm gonna flour my hands a little bit and we're gonna stretch this loaf. So what we wanna do is just take a side, kind of like this, fold it up, and stretch it over. Now for me, a lot of times I see people do it on the counter. Sometimes it's just easier for me to just take the whole thing, stretch it out, and fold it over like this. So I do that just a couple times until you really feel the tension in the dough. Like as you can see, it's not stretching much anymore, it's very tense. So I put it back on the floured surface, flour it just a little bit, and then I do this cupping motion to get it into a nice round circle. Just do that as many times as you desire, and it should look like a nice little loaf. Now we let that sit for 10 minutes. In the meantime, there's some prep work we can do. So I got out my little sourdough kit. Now we have one of these little bowls with the kind of linen inside. I have a couple bench scrapers and the scoring knife. These I don't really use much, honestly. I know some people use them a lot, especially if you're making like a huge loaf and you need to like divide it or something. I usually bake a loaf at a time, so I use it for cleanup and like scraping my counter pretty much. That I don't use it much. After the 10 minutes has passed, you're just gonna flip this loaf and put it into your floured bowl, cover it with a wet paper towel, and let it rest for 30 minutes. It's been 10 minutes, and I'm just gonna take this, kind of cupping the loaf as I go. I tend to cup it a few more times in my hand, just, I don't know, to be extra sure there's a lot of tension in the dough. I will cup it a few more times and then flip it into my basket. Now you should see all the folds on top where you were kind of cupping it. So that is a good sign. Cover it with your wet towel and I'll see you back in 30 minutes. At this point, you want to heat up your oven to 450 degrees. It's important to have the Dutch oven in your oven when you're heating it up with the lid on. The next thing I do is prepare my parchment paper. So I used to just throw a big square of parchment paper in the Dutch oven, but it would fold all kind of weird. So now I cut out the corners of my parchment paper, and then you're gonna put your loaf right in the center there. Again, I fold it a couple more times and stick it right in the center. I flour the whole surface, and then it's time to score it. So I do definitely one deep score like that, and then some just lighter scoring on the other side. You can get as simple or as fancy as you want, but you want to have that deep score so it allows it to rise. At this point, the oven and your Dutch oven are hot, so you put it in covered at 450 degrees for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, you take off the lid and bake it for another 30 minutes. And at that point, your loaf is all done. This loaf turned out beautifully, if I do say so myself. I put it on a cooling rack to let it completely cool, and then I cut it for the week. I put it in the freezer, so I cut it in slices, put it in a Ziploc bag. Try not to stack them completely on top of each other, or else they kind of freeze together. I try to stagger them, so some are kind of horizontal, some are vertical, and it helps a lot when you're trying to take one out of the freezer to eat throughout the week. So put that in a Ziploc, and it was a success. So thank you all so much for watching the video. Make sure to subscribe, and I will see you all next video. Bye everyone.